Cathars in the Comedy, Marco Lombardo. Among the many in the comedy who say how beautiful the past was and how sad the present, the most intriguing character is Marco Lombardo. I was a Lombard and I was called Marco. I knew the world's ways, and I loved those goods for which the bows of all men now grow slack. Purgatory 16, 46 to 48. What is this virtue that nobody wants anymore? The totality of civil virtue and chivalry, writes Schiavacci. But these, in 1300, had not decreased, and they would last for some centuries yet. That which had decreased in 1300, compared to a century earlier, was the presence of Catharism, a fate for which truly the bows of all men now grow slack, so as not to end up burned at the stake. Who was Marco Lombardo? To this faceless person is entrusted the greatest political discourse of the Cantica, and perhaps of the poem, writes Anna Maria Chiavacci. And the Bosco Reggio edition, with Marco, one wonders why the poet chose, not only through the expression of this high regret, but also even through the solution of free will and personal responsibility, a man like him who is historically irrelevant. But was he really faceless and historically irrelevant? The information coming from the first commentaries are pure supposition, studded with maybes and probablys. He is believed to have appeared in the second half of the 13th century, and that he was a man of the court, or that he frequented the courts of the time. In short, he is unidentified. And yet, in Italy, a man lived in the preceding century who was called Marco di Lombardia. A document from the first decades of the 13th century speaks of him. In the early periods of Cathar diffusion in Lombardy, there was bishop called Marco Lombardy, under whose system all the Lombards, the Tuscans, and all the people of the Marches were righteous. We have already, page 71, met him. He was the founder and the bishop of the most relevant Cathar church in Italy, that of Concarezzo. To my knowledge, none of the Italian commentators have thought to relate the Dante Marco of Lombardy with the Cathar Marco di Lombardia, and this despite the fact that in the cultural area of the German language, such possibilities were being advanced. Thus, for example, Kurt Leonhard writes, Marco Lombardo, a man not yet identified with certainty, whose name is nevertheless, not perhaps by chance, the same as that of a famous leader of heretics in the 12th century. In the middle canto of the poem, the 16th of Purgatory, the 50th of the poem, Marco emphatically asserts his belief in free will and expounds the Dantean doctrine of the soul. His discourse then takes a political turn that results in an attack against the Church of Rome that is no longer capable of performing the function of spiritual guide because of its interest solely in material things. Principal motive for the criticism of the Church is something different and aligns with one of the nodal thoughts in Dante's political thinking. The Church has unduly arrogated to itself that political power that belongs to the empire. And it will be Marco who will present the picture of two powers, spiritual and temporal, as two suns in contraposition to the theory of the two powers of sun and moon, expounded by Innocent III to ratify the supremacy of the Church over the empire, whose power must come from the Church, as the light of the moon comes from the sun. Dante clearly opposes himself to this idea in the Monarchy, a work condemned not by chance as heretical and burned and placed in the Index, and here he places in the mouth of Marco his own ideas. The two powers are independent, they are not like the sun and the moon, but rather and precisely two suns. Marco's words are a hymn to man's liberty and political autonomy, social and religious, which were an essential component of the Cathar message. Beyond the homonymy and the exposition of ideas that make part of the ideological baggage of the Cathars, there is a further element that leads to the identification of Dantean characters with the Cathar bishop, the use of expressions that are typical of the Cathars. In the first place, the Church of Rome. It is the only time it occurs in the poem. Today it sounds normal, but in those days the Church of Rome was used only by the Cathars, certainly not by the Catholic Church, which proposed itself as the only church. Page 72, the church, period. To specify which church was the Cathars, it proposed itself as an alternative church, calling itself the Church of God, Church of Christ, Church of John against the Church of Peter, or the Church of Love as against the Church of Rome. In another passage, Marco Lombardo laments that there are no more good people. The adjective good accompanies practically all the various names that the Cathars affixed to the consolati: good men, good beards, good Christians. Also, their death, having received the consolamentum, and that had thereby released them from the cycle of reincarnation, was called good finish, bona fide in Occitan, and the creation of the spiritual entities was called the good creation. Analyses of the word buono in the comedy gives surprising results. It's true that we're dealing with a word in common use if we want to understand. We cannot not take into account the particular use that the Cathars made of it. One of the many red threads that run completely through the poem is the heartfelt observation that there no longer are good people, the good have disappeared. Love and courtesy have been destroyed. It seems evident to me that this nostalgia of Dante's refers to the Cathars, and for two reasons. The only thing that effectively disappeared in those years was precisely and only Catharism, and the terms used were those that characterized them: good people, good, love, courtesy. One could see an adherence on Dante's part to Catharism in the first words that he addresses to Marco Lombardo immediately after the latter told him his name. By fate I bind myself to you. The expression seems a bit exaggerated if it is only to say I promise you, and if without doubt the literal sense, the complete phrase is by fate I bind myself to you to do what you ask me. But out of context, by fate I bind myself to you means I am bound to you by the same faith.